Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Whether you're in need of a website, domain, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. So one of the questions that I probably get asked the most is, how do I edit my film? Do I touch it? Do I leave it like a purist? Or am I out there going crazy in Photoshop? So today, I thought we'd sit down and edit a whole roll of film together, maybe some extra images at the end, and just show you a bit of behind the scenes. And first off, I think it's good to preface with, editing is completely preference based. There's technically no right or wrong. Admittedly, there's some bad taste, but do whatever you want and whatever makes the images that you want to see. For me personally, I don't go too crazy in post, and for me, one of the big advantages of shooting film is how little work in post that I have to do. But do whatever you want, and if you are a purist and think that you're not allowed to retouch anything, just know that the person scanning your film is already editing for you. So look, just do what makes you happy. So I'm in Adobe Lightroom Classic CC at the moment, which is the old version of Lightroom, which I just think works the best for me. And here I've got a whole roll of film which I shot in a studio on an RZ67. And this has been scanned at Bayer on a Noritsu, and these are medium-sized JPEGs. So the first few photos, you can see I shot with a filter with some stuff, some grease on the front of, to give this kind of soft focus effect. So yeah, if you're wondering, that's what it would look like clean. And yeah, these are the in-camera affected ones. What I use Lightroom for mainly is batch processing. So I will do a whole roll of film at once, or I will do a set of rolls of film if they're shot in the same situation, and then I will take individual selects into Photoshop afterwards. So the first thing which I'm looking to do is just to crop the images. So you can see here that I've got a bit of the scan mask left in my files, which is nice to have so that you know that it's the whole negative, but I don't like it in my photos. I think it looks bad. So I'm going to hit R, which opens the cropping menu, and then I'm going to change the aspect ratio to 4:5, which is what these photos should be because they were shot on a 6:7 camera. And then I'm just going to move in to the pure image area. And an easy way to just then transfer that to the next image is to go to the next one with the arrow keys and then hit previous, where it will do the same crop for you. And these are just kind of initial crops to just get the images cleaned up and at their kind of baseline. And if there's any which need more work, this is something that I do after the point. So for instance, there's two images here which have a bit of the kind of roll of backdrop in the ceiling. So this one, for instance, I think I was actually imagining of taking a photo which more resembles this, but it just didn't happen in camera. So it happens in post. And there's another one which has the same issue up here. So for this one as well, I'm just going to come in a bit tighter. For me, it's not necessarily important to get the crop really dialed in here. It's just to give me a good idea because I'll make all the final tweaks in Photoshop anyway. So judging these images as a whole, the colors are slightly off to me. Everything looks a bit too cool and a bit too green. So this is something which I'll just fix up in the white balance section. I'm just going to add a few points of yellow and a few points of magenta. And this should take it to kind of what I was imagining. So what I do is fix one individual image and then I select all of them and hit sync, and it will add all the changes to the rest of the images. And just judging by a different image, I think this is looking much better. And at this point, I think the images look good on a whole. They're kind of ready to be taken up the next level in Photoshop as opposed to Lightroom. So what I do is select all of them and export them. Here, export them to wherever you need to put them. And if you did have TIFFs or higher resolution photos, I'd export them as TIFFs again, but for this case, they're JPEGs in the first place. So I'm just exporting them as JPEGs. So they've landed over here. And what I do at this point is make my selects of my favorite images. I know that probably two of my favorites out of this set are these two, because I find that like any extra work that I might do in Photoshop to take the images to the next level don't necessarily need to happen to every frame, because it's so unusual to post 10 photos out of a roll, you know. It might just be one or two which makes the cut. I just hacked the mainframe to inform you about our sponsor, Squarespace. Are you looking to build a new website, maybe a portfolio of your photography, or you want to start a blog or open an online store? All of this is made simple with Squarespace. It's super easy to build a professional looking website, and you definitely don't need any prior experience doing so. There's a bunch of different templates and themes to pick from, so they've definitely got something that you'll love. And what's great is, if you sign up using the offer code negative feedback, you'll get 10% off your order. So, what are you waiting for? Go get yourself a lovely new website today with Squarespace. So, I'm going to edit this photo first, just because this one is a bit more messy. And then hopefully I'll be able to transfer the changes I make to this to the other one, like how I did in Lightroom. So the first thing I like to do is a camera raw filter, which you can find in filter and then camera raw filter. And this gives you the kind of same settings you might have in Lightroom. And here I might change the white balance a bit more. I'm still seeing not quite enough warmth. I also normally make some changes to the highlights and shadows, where I decrease the highlights and increase the shadows. And here I'm just going to go -10 +10. And what this does is just provides a little bit more information out of both and makes for a slightly flatter image. And you can see here, if I do a before and after, it's just like a subtle tweak where just this side of the face is just coming back in, and I'm just making sure that anything which is a bit too bright is just brought down slightly. And then something which I would normally do at this point is look for anything in the image that needs to be cleaned up, whether that's some skin that needs retouching or whether there's any kind of grub on the scan that just needs to be removed. So in this case, I think the background's all fine. There's no marks on the backdrop or things that should have been scanned. Oh, spoke too soon. Something there. And it's gone. Spot healing tool works wonders. And in this case, since it's a more kind of fashiony beauty thing, I might get rid of some of the blemishes on his skin just so that it's looking nice and clean. Because we didn't have anyone to do makeup on the day, just got to do it in post. Okay, so when the image is nicely cleaned up to however I'm hoping it to be, this is when I would then go to further stylizing of the image. And I talked about it fairly recently. I've been enjoying warming filters recently. Warmth in my work is something which I've been looking for stylistically, and Photoshop is the way to do this when you live in the UK, since there's no sun. So in the adjustment panel, I choose a photo filter and then the warming filter 81. There's 3 of them. They all have different kind of looks and feels. Just find one that's your preference, or don't use it at all. This is my way of editing, but you're watching me, so who knows. So I changed the blending layer to darken, and I find this just works with the whites a bit nicer. It does tend to add a bit of a green cast to things, but you know, sometimes it's not the end of the world. So you can see it goes various levels of strength, and I think somewhere around the 30% normally is where I rest. And you can see here, it just brings like, it's just like a nice warm hug from the photo, you know, like there's something just like more inviting about this to me. And it also wouldn't be too bad to just turn it down to like 15, and then it's like much more of a subtle thing, and it just takes a bit of like the sterileness out of the whites. It just makes everything feel a little better. So I'm going to go somewhere in the middle, somewhere around 20. And sometimes what I also may do at this point, so I'm just going to blend everything down so I can show in the future the step-by-step. Something which I also might do is add a color balance layer. And if, for instance, here I'm saying, oh, well, the background's gone a bit too green because of this, you can kind of play around with these sliders and bring it back to a bit more of a neutral color. So that would be with and without. And at this point, maybe his skin has just gone a bit too red when I've been counteracting this. So what I could do is just in this layer mask, just reduce what's going on his face. And then, as you can see, it's not really messing up with that area. Another thing which I use frequently is selective color. And the reason I use this a lot of the time is when I've got a photo where someone is not in a studio and they're outside and their skin tones don't really stand out in a contrast sense from other things which are happening in the scene. So the colours I use are the reds and the yellows, and what you can do is just increase the black, and it, as you can see, it kind of makes just the skin tones pop. So if I'm looking for a bit more contrast in just someone's kind of making the pop in the scene, this is something that I would touch, and also sometimes add a bit more yellow to it, or in this case maybe it's the magenta which needs touching because he's going a bit too pink. But I think this is a really helpful thing to look at, to just kind of like, yeah, bring a nice punch to the photos. So this is now pretty much at the point which I would like it to be at. And you can see that this is where it is now, and this is where it was before. And it's just kind of like it's a really subtle difference, but I think it's kind of like the little step that takes things a little bit further. So the way I would then edit the other photo nice and quickly is just going to it, hitting filter, and then the top option is actually a repeat of the last camera raw filter that you did. So don't need to do anything with that. And then you can just drag your adjustment layers and drop them on. And now I've already merged the warming filter, so I remember what the settings were, I can put that back on. But if you hadn't merged stuff, this would be easier. And then this should, in theory, kind of pair up with this in terms of like colors. But yeah, this is how I would edit multiple images at once in Photoshop. So I also thought it might be interesting to edit a drum scan because these come out very differently. So here is a fan favorite, Captain Beanie, shot on 8x10 film. And as you can see, drum scans are much flatter. There's a lot more information in the highlights and shadows, and you can see this in particular when you look at the histogram, that there's really nothing on either end. As I said before in Lightroom, I do the same in Photoshop. These files I work exclusively with in Photoshop just because they're bigger, and they're always single images, not a whole roll, so it kind of just makes sense to use Photoshop. But yeah, I'm just going to crop in for the purpose of not having the border. A quick way to make one of these scans look kind of normal is just to squish the histogram down to where it should be. So that's just taking the blacks and the whites and just squishing them in. And as you can see, this just kind of brings it back to life. So I'm going to duplicate and merge. So I've got a step-by-step kind of track back of it. And then I'm going to open a camera raw filter with this. Just to finalize the exposure and get the rough white balance. So I think at the moment this is slightly too dark, so I'm going to bring that up in the exposure. I'm going to bring the highlights down just to retain the information, add a tiny bit of contrast, and squish the shadows just a little bit. I also know from previous experience that the white balance in this photo is really hard to work with. It was shot on expired Kodak Portra VC, and just the colors were a bit tricky to handle. So I'm gonna leave how it is just for the purpose of this video. So this is now night and day really compared to what it was initially, but I have a few more things which I would normally do. So there's a free plugin on the internet somewhere called the Nick Collection, and there's a subsection of this called Color Effects Pro. This is version 4, and the contrast in this program, called Pro Contrast, is really nice to work with. It's a really good way of bringing out like a bit more punch out of your photos. The problem with using it on these drum scans is that this is probably a 120 megapixel file, and that's just a lot of processing for your computer, so it takes a little bit of time. So this is Pro Contrast. So we've got 3 sliders to play with. The first, it corrects kind of white balance and color casts, and as you can see on 100% it normally goes further than it needs to, but normally somewhere in the first 50% is an improvement to your photo, if it's wrong in the first place, that is. And it's really nice for it to do this in an automatic way. It's a lot less work for you to do. And then it's got 2 contrast sliders. So the first one is just normal contrast, and I normally have this not too high up, it depends on the photo, but I'm going to put this on 20%. Something which I find really helpful about this contrast slider as opposed to a adjustment layer is that you also have these sliders for the shadows and the highlights. So if you have an image where you want to bring a bit more contrast but you don't want it to clip the highlights, you can come up and turn this slider up or down and it will reduce the contrast in the highlights but just in the mids and shadows. I just find this really helpful because often when I'm trying to increase the contrast, I'm losing either the shadows or the highlights. And then there's dynamic contrast, which I tend to not play with too much because as you can see, it's like a bit clarity-esque. It's really good at bringing out details in textures, and I normally just have it like on a tiny bit just to increase kind of sharpness, but not really give that crunchy effect. So I think this looks good, and I'm just going to hit OK and wait a lifetime for it to save because, as I said, this file is huge. Here we can see the before and after of what it's done. I think it's... Maybe you think this is subtle. Personally, I think this is a night and day difference in terms of just like overall sharpness. So now, you could call it quits. This is a pretty good looking image at this point. But I know to make this pop a little bit further, I would use a selective color. So the reason why this image is great, in my opinion, is because Beanie is wearing such a bright orange suit in contrast to this really dreary block of flats in the background. So to just make it pop that bit further, I would use a selective color on the yellows and reds. As you can see, this tampers with a bit of the grass and a bit of him. Maybe the reds will be more so him and less... Yeah, so the reds is what we want to play with. And I just want to increase the contrast on him, so I'm going to add to the blacks. And then I'm also going to try and get the orange to just sit a bit more vivid in the scene. And I will do this by adding some yellow and magenta. And maybe removing a bit of cyan. It's something you just got to play with until it looks quite right. So I think it's going to be this way. And then as you can see, it's just like bringing a bit of richness to his suit. When you look at it here, it looks a bit dull. And then when you add it in, it's just bringing that bit of contrast back and a bit of richness and saturation without making the whole scene look vivid. So then I've noticed when this is brighter, this strip of grass in the background looks a bit too unsaturated in comparison. So I would also change the greens and just slide up the blacks and maybe add a tiny bit of yellow to it. And then I know that the yellows were also affecting the greens pretty harsh. So I'd add a bit of black in that as well. And then you can see that this simple selective color really brings like the life back into the image. And at this point, I'd probably call it done. And now I could show you editing more photos, but I've pretty much shown you what I do to everything. There's not much to it. It's just a bit of intuition and playing around until you figure out what you like. Yeah, as I said, there's no right, there's no wrong. Go out there and make your photos look how you want them to look. And if you want to Photoshop something into your photos and break all the rules, do it. I won't judge you. Thank you very much to you for watching this. Hopefully you've learned something, and if not, been mildly entertained. I think the next video you're going to see is either about printing books, or it's going to be a nice vlog in Portugal. I mean, it hasn't happened yet. I'm presuming it's happening with me and Kian, because we're going to go do a panel at a film festival about the unexposed. So stay tuned.